I'd like to welcome Dr. Kenneth Clark to the program. Dr. Clark is a board-certified pathologist by the American Board of Pathology in forensic pathology, anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, and neuropathology. He served as a forensic pathologist in the Onondaga County Medical Examiner's Office, as well as associate medical examiner in the Allegheny County Medical Examiner's Office. He's also served as an assistant professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at SUNY Upstate Medical University and as an adjunct professor of forensic science at Syracuse University. And if those aren't bona fides prior to your medical career and education, you also earned your Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering. So welcome back to the show, Kenny. Good to have you.
It's good to be here, Gavin. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. So what I wanted to talk to you today is about a conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago. I was asking you specifically about the two puncture wounds, is what I'm calling them, on Amanda Wienckowski's jawline. They're kind of right here, that appear to me to be like an electrical stun gun, kind of like somebody jabbed it into her face and turned on the stun gun.
Right.
Now, really, am I to understand that by looking at the photographs, there's really no way to kind of prove that based on the photography?
Yeah, correct. There's no way. A lot of different things, especially when you're talking post-mortem, a lot of different things can cause, wounds can have a general appearance, be it a bug bite, be it, as you're describing, something electrical. All you can say is really that there's a wound. Without looking at it under the microscope or knowing more details of the case, there's no way you can really ascertain what caused it.
So without some extra steps to investigate that, it would be appropriate to put on, the medical examiner's report that these are 2 1/8 inch, wounds on the face, right? Something like that.
Yes.
Okay. So if you were to, I guess, examine it more closely, how would you determine whether something is like a stun gun wound? What would you do to go about figuring that out?
Well, what I would do exclusively is I would start by taking a biopsy of the actual lesion itself. Lesion just means a focal abnormality. So I would take a biopsy, a small piece of the tissue that you think is the wound, make histologic slides out of it and look at it under the microscope. And the reason I would do that is in my career, I've seen one case of that I ruled as high voltage electrocution. It was an accident. That was the cause of death. And in that case, you don't often get to see this because electrocution injuries aren't something we commonly see. We actually took microscopic slides. We made microscopic slides of that tissue for examination. And one of the things you were able to see under the microscope is that in high voltage electrocutions, there are very predictable histologic changes. In other words, changes to the tissue that you see under the microscope that have striking contrast to what you normally see in non-electrocuted skin. So I would, if I had any suspicion that there was an electrocution element in that, I would definitely take a biopsy of the skin, look at it under the microscope.
You said that you put together slides. So if you take a biopsy of that lesion, what is it that you do with that tissue to make the slides? I think you described that to us once before.
Yeah. It's a process that's done in a laboratory. It's not that I do anything with it, but essentially what happens is you take the tissue. You want to make the tissue such that you can cut just a few micron thick sections of the tissue, stain it with stains that highlight the tissue microscopically. And then but you want it thin enough that you can shine light through it and the light will go through and you can see it in a microscope. So in order to do that, what you got to do essentially is you have to dehydrate the tissue. First, you fix the tissue with formaldehyde. And formaldehyde, it cross-links, it basically fixes everything inside the cell, the proteins, the nucleic acids, things like that. Then you take the water out of it, dehydrate the tissue, and you impregnate the tissue, if you will, with something like paraffin or wax to make it firm, so you can actually cut this, the slides that you want. And then you put it on something called a microtome, which is it's a machine that will cut very extremely thin slices of this paraffin embedded tissue. And then you stain it with hematoxylin and eosin. There's a process involved. And then you put a cover slip on it and you throw it under the microscope.
So, I mean, it's a long process. I would imagine that you would really have to suspect that there was an electrocution event in order to do that. I mean, that's a long process, right?
Well, it is a long process, but in most histology labs, truth be told, is they're automated, semi-automated in their batch process. So to throw one extra cassette of tissue in is no big deal. The issue becomes, what we do though in pathology, it's what limits us is simply everything you put in to make a slide out of, you're kind of obligated to look at. So in the world of forensics, when there's no shortage of deaths and there's always work to be done, we don't routinely take sections of anything for examination that we don't really need to. So in the absence of a real need, in other words, if someone dies of a heart attack and we know that and the autopsy confirms it and the toxicology is negative, we're never going to take a skin biopsy because there's no point in doing it. It's not going to contribute anything. So in a case where, a skin finding might actually be contributory, significantly contributory, that's a case where I would probably take multiple biopsies.
Gotcha.
Just have them processed.
What are you looking for? Once you look under the microscope, what is it that you're looking for in an electrocution event that would be different than just looking at skin, that hadn't been electrocuted?
Right. Well, there are three features, and again, this is in my own experience. There are three features that are that will tell the story if there is a high voltage electrocution type of injury. One thing is that, as you know, electrical current generates heat, right? That's why you have breaker panels in the house. It's to prevent fire is what it's, over too much current will generate too much heat. And it's the same thing happens in the skin. Stands to reason that one of the things that happens if you run too much current through the skin, as you would see in a high voltage situation, and you generate enough heat, a couple of things are going to happen. One is you're actually going to, whatever water's in the skin, you're actually going to boil it. What happens is the way the skin is, the architecture of the skin, you have a superficial layer, an external layer of the skin it's what makes the skin tough, right? It's why you can scratch your hand and it doesn't rub off. It's the wear and tear part of the skin. It's called the epidermis. Underneath the epidermis is what we call the dermis, and that's where you get your blood supply and a lot of things go on in the dermis. But those two, the epidermis and the dermis, are actually distinct histological layers. And when you get water boiling in the skin that I've seen in electrical injuries, what happens is those two layers essentially separate and lift off from one another. So you get these little, what appears to be small blisters directly underneath the epidermis. So that's one thing. The second thing that I've seen is there's a lot of connective tissue, structural tissue in the skin. And if there's enough current that runs through long enough, what I've seen is that connective tissue, that structural tissue, actually will kind of meld together. It becomes very amorphous looking. In other words, it doesn't have this distinct look that you usually see in a skin biopsy. It looks like it's been melted together. Let's put it that way. And the third thing that I think is most striking and most telling is a lot of the proteins and nucleic acids, DNA, that are inside each cell, they're charged. They actually have an electrical charge to them. So you can imagine if you apply voltage of any kind, especially high voltage, to a piece of skin or any piece of tissue, and you let the current run, those proteins and nucleic acids are actually going to migrate. I mean, they're going to move. And the consequence of that histologically is that we see what I call nuclear streaming, where the nuclei in these cells, which have a very predictable look, a very usual look in a normal skin biopsy, these nuclei will start to stretch out, and they actually look like streaming, if you will, like blades of grass that are kind of getting blown in the same direction. So it's a combination of the amorphous looking connective tissue, the blistering, the subepidermal blistering, and the nuclear streaming. When I see those three things in the context of the right story, I would not hesitate to say that injury is due to electrical, too much voltage or too much current.